It's more about recognizing that they're not going anywhere, and therefore we're gonna have to figure out a way um, to live alongside one another. And I think the way we're not doing a great job of that.
I remember interacting with people across the country, hearing people call Trump voters stupid, uneducated, backward. And I always took this to heart because for a lot of my life, these were my neighbors, right? They were my teachers. They were my, operators of my favorite local business, what have you. I've always thought, and this applies for conservatives who call liberal voters stupid as well, I've always believed that you can hate the politician. You can have a very strong dislike of Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or whoever it is, but you can't hate the voter. You can't hate the voter. Welcome to Our Great Experiment. Today I am happy to be joined by my friend and colleague, Milo Greenberg. How are you doing, Milo?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Milo and I, we first met a couple years back at the Henry Clay Center, which is a bipartisan, compromised-oriented program that brings students from all over the country, all 50 states, with differing backgrounds, ideologies, together for 2 weeks to have civil discourse, work together. And I thought it was quite a cool experience for me in the sense that I'm from South Dakota, a rather homogenous state. And so I think when I met you at the Henry Clay event, that was the first time in my life that I got to experience the U.S. as a microcosm. In other words, I thought that program did a really good job of representing the country as a whole, which is something that I had never been exposed to. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you.
Yeah. No, Henry Clay was a lot of fun. It was great to meet people from all across the country. And yeah, it's been a long time. So I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, and so given, the history of when we first met, it was all about compromise, bipartisanship, and polarization is deeply etched into that. And I started this platform with the hopes of doing my small part to lessen polarization. So it's no coincidence that I want to talk to you about polarization. And so I guess to start, before we focus on how we can get out of this cycle of hatred and polarization and deepening and divides, I think it's important to understand exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about polarization. And so when you understand polarization, Milo, I think of, the majority of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, viewing our deep divides as an issue in and of itself. The fact that a vast majority of Americans believe that we simply can't agree on basic facts. How do you understand what polarization is?
Yeah. So, I think when people just use the word polarization, they can be referring to a few different things, right? So one thing that sometimes people are referring to is sorting or partisan polarization, which basically just means the sorting of uh, ideological strains into different parties, right? So in the 20th century, for at least a lot of the 20th century, we had liberal Republicans, we had conservative Democrats, as well as liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, right? The parties were not ideologically sorted. Now we have, there's not really any such thing anymore as a conservative Democrat or a liberal Republican. And so, right, when you think about that, that's that's what we might call sorting, right? The ideological sorting of the parties. Another kind of polarization is what we might call ideological polarization, right? Which is where people's ideological positions become farther apart, right? The mainstream liberals become more liberal, conservatives become more conservative, right? Their ideologies, their policy preferences become further apart, ideological polarization. And then there's what we call affective polarization, right? Which is the feeling of distrust or dislike or between people of different ideological different parties, or ideologies. So there's an example that Ezra Klein gives in his book, Why We're Polarized, I think is illustrative, right? So if on the issue of, say, marijuana legalization, right? If 40% of the country wants marijuana to be legalized, and 40% wants it to be illegal, and 20% doesn't know, and each of those groups are divided evenly among the parties, right? So there are 20% of those people of the people that want it legalized are Democrats. You have 20% of the people, or 50% of the people who want it legalized are Democrats. 50% of the people who want it to be illegal are Republicans, and 50% of the people who don't know are Democrats and stay with Republicans. Then you're neither polarized nor are you sorted. Um, if all the people who want it legalized are Democrats and all the people who want it to be illegal are Republicans, now you have partisan polarization or sorting. But you'll notice there that the people's political opinions on marijuana haven't actually changed. They're just sorted into distinct parties. If the 20% of people who haven't made up their minds then go ahead and make up their minds, 10% of them decide they want it to be legal and they join the Democrats, and and the other half decide that they want it to be illegal and join the Republicans. Now we have ideological polarization, right? There's less people in the middle. And if the Democrats then say, man, those Republicans who want marijuana to be illegal are, crazy and racist and whatever, right? And we have that kind of increase in malice and distrust. That's affective polarization, right? And if the Republicans who do not want it to be made legal say, oh, those Democrats are just a bunch of hippies, and whatever, and then that is affective polarization. And at least for me, that right affective polarization, that kind of polarization is the thing that I'm most concerned with. And I think when I talk to people, that is the kind of polarization that they are most often concerned with when we're talking about polarization. Um, yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly useful and necessary to distinguish between issue-based polarization, disagreements on policy between the two parties, and what's referred to as affective polarization, right? The emotional hatred of the other side. And I am by no means an expert on polarization, but in the span of the time that I've been interested in studying polarization, I've always thought that what is driving American polarization is not disagreements on healthcare. It's not even disagreements on immigration as much as we might think it is. It is affective polarization from my perspective. And the analogy to sports I find to be quite revealing. As someone who enjoys sports quite thoroughly, in sports fandom in general, we wear the team's memorabilia, we put on the hat, we cheer for teams that we might not even live in the same city as, we cheer for teams comprised of people making millions of dollars, and we hate the rival. We hate the rival for the simple fact that they are not our team. And I couldn't think of a better analogy for modern politics. We Republicans hate Democrats because they are simply the outgroup. They are not on our side. And I'm curious, when you think of what's driving polarization today, do you see policy differences as having a legitimate force driving polarization, or is it almost all done by the work of affective polarization?
Yeah. I think policy preference definitely plays a role. But it is not the primary driver. I think the primary driver of affective polarization is what we might call group psychology, right? The desire that people have to be part of a group, to be in good standing with that group. And this is a kind of deeply rooted need that people have. In the Stone Age, if the group didn't like you and kicked you out, then you died. And so, people, there's a really significant uh, kind of psychological motivation to favor, what you see as your in group, and to have distrust of out groups. And I mean, there's all sorts of ways to study this, that psychologists and political scientists have pursued, that really demonstrate that when it comes to polarization, the main driver is this group psychology. I think, rough estimates would suggest that it's about 25% ideological, or, kind of ideological differences, and 75%, the desire to see, the in-group, if you're a Democrat, to want to see the Democrats win, if you're a Republican, to see the Republicans win. And fear of the out-group, the fear that, if you're a Democrat, that if Republicans win, then that kind of represents your group has been defeated, it's been subjugated, humiliated. And that can really be really a big fear, that gets at these dynamics in group psychology. And yes, I mean, you can do studies like, let's see, there's a study where participants were given a math problem, but they had participants from each political party, right? And participants were given a a word problem, and initially it was just like, I don't know, it was like skin cream or something. Any of them to figure out, how effective is this skin cream at making your skin nicer or whatever. I don't know. And it was kind of a tricky problem, but people with good math skills generally did well on this problem. They can kind of work their way through it. People with lesser math skills didn't do quite as well. But then when they reframed the question to be about like how effective gun control laws were, right? People's people who are Democrats, if depending on how the question was worded, would tend to get the question wrong. If the correct answer to the question tended to suggest that gun control laws were not effective. And again, this is like a fake problem. They just made it up. It's not, the statistics aren't real. But even so, the fear that the answer to this problem might represent a defeat for the participants in group, presented a threat and made them more likely to get the problem incorrect. And that's one example of something. There's all sorts of studies that really demonstrate how deep this group psychology goes, and how much of an impact it can have on the way that we see the world, I guess. And so, I think the important takeaway here is that there's not need to be a rational basis for effective polarization, right? It's not primarily driven by ideological preferences, but rather by group psychology.
Yeah, and I think one thing that only furthers this point is that in the political science literature, there's quite some disagreement about whether or not parties have become more extreme. There's a lot of disagreement about whether the Republican Party or the Democratic Party is more extreme ideologically than they were, say, 70 years ago. However, there is almost unanimous agreement that the parties have become more sordid. And in her book, Uncivil Agreement, Liliana Mason describes this sort of mega-identity. And for those listening, MEGA, not MAGA. And as the parties have become more distinct, these mega-identities represent the characteristics of the voters that comprise each party increasingly becoming homogenized. Parties becoming almost stereotyped by who represents the party, by religion, race, sexuality, geography, a host of social identity characteristics the parties are diverging from each other on. And that's not to say that this is a perfect analogy, right? That, for example, take religion. There are certainly deeply religious Democrats, and there are secular Republicans. But as a whole, the trend points to a clear notion that the Republican Party over time has become the party of religion, and the Democratic Party has become the party of secularism. And I see this sorting by identity as a problem in two regards. The first is obvious. If we not only view the other party winning majority status in government as a threat to our ideology, which it certainly is, right? If I'm a Democrat and the Republican wins, it's a threat to my goals, of course. But if it's not just ideology, if the other party wins and that's a threat to my sense of religion, my racial identity, my sexual identity, whatever, elections literally become life or death. If the other party wins, I am at severe risk. That's the first problem from my perspective. The second problem is that this sorting almost discourages cross-cutting identities, in the sense that I have seen individuals, myself included, who don't fit neatly into one of these categories face social outcasting, and they often face pressure, getting called derogatory names because they're viewed as traitors to their cause, whether that cause is their identity itself or the party. And so I guess I'm just curious, from your perspective, do you think most Americans fit neatly into one of these categories? And because these categories are very broad, but do you think most Americans fit into these two categories?
Um, I mean, I think it's certainly true that that is becoming more and more the case, right? It um, was not always the case that people who lived in cities were liberal and people who lived in rural areas were conservative. Maybe there was some tendency, but now the tendency is much greater. You know, people who that in terms of population density. Um, you know, it. Um, I mean, even now, you know, we're seeing gender sorting as well, where men are more likely to be Republicans and women are more likely to be Democrats. That's new. You know, I think this is a more recent trend, but it's that has never been the case before. Um, you know, it has not always been the case that liberals and conservatives were so divided on where we go grocery shopping, you know, like Trader Joe's versus Cracker Barrel. I don't know. You ever just see those those videos on like TikTok or whatever, where it's like showing my conservative friend Trader Joe's, and it's like a joke where he's, you know, like giving him a tour. It's like, whoa, I've never been here before. Um, right, it's funny, but it's like that's like what is that? Like how why is this related? um, it so you know, I mean, I think of course there still remains certain cross-cutting identities. You know, there are. I spent a year living in Eastern Oregon, and I met plenty of Democrats that lived there. Even though it's generally considered to be a more of a red area, um, but you know, the data demonstrates that yes, we are kind of stacking more and more identities um, together. You know, that a person's ideological leanings are now predictive of many more aspects of their identity than used to be the case. You know, if you know they're liberal, you can predict that they are more likely to be Democrat. You can predict that they are more likely to be non-white. You can predict they are more likely to be female. You can predict that they are more likely to be LGBT. You can predict that they are more likely to live in an urban area. You can predict they're more likely to shop at Trader Joe's. You know, I mean, the number of identities that are aligned with a person's ideology and political party um, are increasing.
I'm really happy you bring up gender, because I think back to, you know, as I'm sure this speaks for most people who are, you know, nerding out about politics. I was following the 24 election very closely to look at how votes broke down by race, by gender, etc. And at first glance, regardless of the outcome, not speaking to that, but just looking at our racial divide, I was at first given some hope, because there seemed to be a little bit more crossover, more Hispanic voters going to the Republican Party, more white voters going to the Democratic Party. And at first I thought, well, there's a sign of hope, right? Maybe we're starting to see less stringent divides by race on which parties uh, people vote for. And then those hopes were crushed because in the aftermath of the election, exit polling was conducted on the gender divide. And I think it was something like, especially for young people, those ages 18 to 30, young men went for Vice President Harris. Young women went for Vice President Harris by 30 points, and young men went for President Trump by 16 points, something of that nature. And you remark on it's relatively unprecedented for partisanship and polarization to now be divided by gender. And I wonder if, and my hope would be that this is just a artifact of our time, given that abortion is a very salient issue for many voters, and that it's become really pressing at the national level over the past 5 years. That maybe that is simply just an artifact of our time, but it will certainly be fascinating to watch how as we get further and further away from the Dobbs decision, whether or not that gender divide hardens, crystallizes, or if it lessens. I don't know.
Yeah. I would expect it to widen, just looking at, like we talked about every other identity, maybe not every, but many identities are becoming more and more predictable based on a person's political ideology. I don't see why this particular identity would become less predictable, would contradict that trend. Um, and it's always difficult to tease out because as you mentioned, right? I mean, abortion, for example, is an issue that's likely to be, um, uh, women are. If Democrats say we're gonna, fight for abortion rights, women, that's more likely to resonate with women and make women want to support Democrats than it is for men, right? That's kind of more of an ideological preference or policy preference thing, and that kind of makes sense. Um, and yet at the same time, it's also true that Republicans kind of market themselves as um, representing men, the male identity, in a way that Democrats don't. And so it can be difficult, right, to tease out that kind of more identity-based politics, which has more to do with the effect of polarization, as opposed to policy proposals, which has more to do with ideological um, polarization. But um, I do think that, and I think it is both, but I do think that effective polarization is playing a significant role. I'll give you an example from my life. I recently read a book by Richard Reeves it's called Boys and Men. It's talking about like men's issues and how there are certain ways that men are I guess kind of falling behind in areas of society. He talks about education and other policy and other social areas too. And it's a really interesting book. And I was reading last year, and I um, was I took it with me to like basically a conference that I went to, and one of my friends who's also at the conference came in my room. We were hanging out, and she saw the book, and so we're both um, kind of more left leaning. And she saw that book and she kind of like laughed. She's like, who's reading this? I was like, I was reading this, and she's like, oh, haha. Yeah, and she kind of thought it was like a little ridiculous, I guess, that I had this book, because we're both kind of more left leaning people, and that kind of um, is inconsistent, I guess, with a more liberal identity. And I think, um, I think if you think about that logically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The policies that Reeves recommends in the book are not really conservative as I would imagine them. And my friend who saw that I was reading this book didn't necessarily know that I even agreed with everything that Reeves said or anything. And yet just my possession of this book, I think represented something that she perceived as a threat to kind of a liberal identity. Um, And so, I think that's kind of an example of a way that um, the uh, that's an example of how more these more identity based or polarization, affective polarization, can have an impact on our life, even when it's completely separated from any kind of policy rationale.
That's interesting, right? I've often dealt with that same. Uh, for me, I guess it would be fear, because depending on my environment, who I'm surrounded by, I've often thought of, well, if I'm in a conservative environment and I'm reading a book by a liberal scholar or a liberal thinker, maybe I should hide the book, right? Or if I'm in a liberal area and I'm reading a book by a conservative thinker, I'm a bit more weary of speaking about the book or letting people know that I'm reading the book. And that in and of itself is problematic, because I think we should encourage a society in which you read and engage with ideas that are antithetical to your ideology. But that's a conversation for another time, I guess. But thinking specifically about the gender gap, I think I don't have statistics in front of me, but I am aware of the fact that pretty recently women became more represented at universities, for instance, than young men. Women are graduating with 4-year degrees at higher rates than men are, and there's a whole host of statistics that point to this gap between what men are kind of pursuing with their lives and what women are pursuing with their lives. And I fear that you're right, that it is ripe for a further cleavage. Um, but I guess we'll just have to see how that plays out. But I think we've had a sufficient enough conversation on what polarization is, how we understand it in the modern era. But I want to jump to something that I think is more fascinating and maybe a bit more naive, and that's solutions. Thinking about how we actually, if we can at all, help make polarization less worse, or even potentially make it better. Thinking specifically through a political lens, how we can make institutional changes. This concept of democratization, how further access to the ballot box, more representative institutions. Can you describe to me how you think democratizing our institutions would potentially help ease polarization?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the institution that we're talking about. Um, but I think one example is in the House of Representatives. We have single member districts. We have gerrymandering, by which politicians can essentially choose the voters that they need to win. And um, we have a primary system that um, really incentivize that, in order to even make it to a general election, you have to win the votes of the most polarized voters. The people who vote in primaries are generally more engaged than the general electorate, and tend to identify more closely with their ideological identity. Democrats that vote in primaries usually see their democratic or liberal identity as being very important to them in a way that the general electorate is not as true. Um, and so, I think if the House were, um, if we had ranked choice voting for House elections, and if we had multi-member districts, so that say there were three representatives for each district rather than just one. I think that would incentivize candidates to be less concerned with appealing to their most polarized voters, um, because they would not be as because they wouldn't have to go through that kind of primary system, right? The we we could just have a ranked choice system where um, rather than a primary and everyone makes it into general election. That also I think incentivizes third parties, right? Third party candidates, not in a ranked choice system, do not have to drop out in order to avoid splitting the vote for a second choice candidate. And so I think that is important as well. So that I think that helps reduce polarization. And I mean, I think this may be kind of a separate point, but I think getting rid of gerrymandering would help too. Where um, candidates would have to appeal to a broader base, I guess, of or a broader electorate in order to win their elections, which is more an electorate which is more representative of kind of the general region of their state that they're representing, rather than kind of picking and choosing an electorate which that they can kind of tailor a more polarizing strategy to win.
Thinking specifically about gerrymandering right now, from my knowledge, which I will, say is quite limited, we seem to be in a very unprecedented time. We're in the middle of a decade. The census comes out, and usually the first year after a new decade, right? So the 2020 census came out in 2021, and states redistrict. However, because our national house is divided, I think, by 3 votes right now, states are literally trying to scratch and claw in the middle of a decade, right before a midterm election, to try to squeeze out one more seat. One more seat. This is happening in the state I currently reside. There's a big controversy over a new Missouri redistricting plan that essentially would gut. There's 8 seats. Democrats control 2, and the new plan has essentially redistrict Kansas City to make it so that there would only be one Democratic seat in the state. And I don't bring this up to call out Republicans, because surely gerrymandering is a bipartisan agreement, unfortunately. But we're seeing these mechanisms used in ways that certainly they've always been used to gerrymander. But in the middle of a decade, a year out from a midterm election that has huge stakes for the current occupant of the White House, it's rather unprecedented. But I want to think specifically, too, about the Senate filibuster, because I think maybe we'll have divergent opinions on this. Could you talk to me about where you see the filibuster's role in polarization?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes hand in hand with the way that the Senate is structured, right, whereby it's each state has 2 representatives, and it's not proportionally representative of the country population. And presently that gives Republicans a fairly substantial advantage, because most of the smaller states lean red. And what that means is that the Republican Party can appeal to a fairly small um, number of voters in order to uh, essentially hamstring a Democratic agenda, even if Democrats have won a very substantial have taken a substantial win, in the most recent election. And I think that that has a polarizing effect, because it means that the Republican Party is able to appeal to a kind of smaller cross section of voters, a particularly polarized set of voters, and don't have to necessarily have such a broad appeal in order to effectively hamstring a Democratic agenda. Um, I think it's possible that making it easier for a political party that wins a significant majority of the votes to enact an agenda, would make it easier for the American public to decide whether they like that agenda. Um, now I part of me also thinks, that having um, a simple majority, a 50 vote threshold, um, that could potentially be an issue insofar as you might have laws changing all the time, and that could have kind of a destabilizing effect. And so I think that's something you have to balance out. But on the whole, um, right now I think that being able to win what is essentially a controlling um, uh, coalition in the Senate with so few um, like votes in an election has a polarizing effect.
Yeah, I take your points, and I don't necessarily disagree with any of them on their face. One thing I would point, though, is as we are recording this on October 18th, the government is still shut down. And I would actually argue right now the filibuster is not stopping a democratic agenda. It's actually working in reverse. It's stopping a Republican agenda, right? The Democrats have certain um, asks, specifically about the extension of um, Affordable Care Act subsidies, and that's really put a halt to negotiations. But I would liken my fear of the filibuster being taken away to what is currently going on with executive power. I've long thought that one solution to polarization would be a taking away of power from the executive and a reassertion of power in the legislative branch, where power is, from my perspective, more legitimate, given that it is a representative body of the entire country, not just one individual who won a majority or sometimes not even a majority of the voters. But I liken, you talk about, in the absence of a filibuster, would there be a constant back and forth between who controls the Senate? Would there be a constant back and forth between national policy? And I certainly fear that there might. But is this any different than what we see currently with executive power? Every 4 years, we typically get a new president whose day one objectives is simply reversing the executive orders of the prior president. We saw this with President Biden when he took office in January of 2021. He reversed substantial portions of the Trump executive agenda, and we saw this in January 2025, right? Trump's major accomplishments to this point in his presidency have all been done through executive power. And I don't know if you want to comment on whether or not executive power has resulted in further polarization, but I certainly think there is something to be said about an electorate getting together every 4 years and staking all of their hopes, fears on one individual. Every election's about huge issues. Can the president solve the economy? Can the president fix immigration? Can the president get us out of foreign wars? And that seems like an awful lot of agenda control and power for one individual to have.
Um, I'm not. I'm not quite sure I understand your point. How is this related um, to the structure of the Senate?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily, but I liken,
Okay.
in the absence of a filibuster, right, dramatic and rapid changeovers of policy. Say, currently the Republicans control the Senate. John Thune has been relatively hesitant to get rid of the legislative filibuster, but let's say he did, right? And the Republicans have 53 seats in the Senate. So over the next year until the midterms, they could likely pass whatever legislation they wanted to. Democrats take power of both houses come November. They could reverse everything. Rapid changes in national policy via the legislature. I simply liken this to executive power, something we are already seeing done. There's rapid swings because there's really no advising consent. In the executive branch, one person can sign, hundreds and hundreds of executive orders simply reversing the policy that has been being conducted by the executive branch over the past 4 years. It's not a perfect comparison, but I liken this current state of executive power to what I fear the Senate would look like in the absence of a filibuster.
I mean, I think you have your kind of cause and effect backwards. I don't think that the I think the reason we are seeing, you know, rapid changes in um, the uh, I guess the executive policy is because we keep going back and forth is because we were polarized, and therefore national elections tend to be really close and we're going back and forth between uh, a liberal and a conservative in the White House. I mean, and it's very difficult to come to a kind of a consensus on any policy issue. I don't think it's the capacity of the president to undo their predecessors' executive orders that's leading to polarization.
No, no, no. I'm not saying that the use of executive orders is leading to polarization. But if we're thinking about the undoing of the filibuster as a potential way of democratizing the public square to lessen polarization, I fear, because certainly the ability for a president to get his or her party's agenda through via executive order has certainly not resulted in less polarization. I would argue that the use of executive orders has only amplified polarization. And so I'm just curious, and again, I push back not only to understand your argument, but to better solidify mine. I just have a hard time understanding how the elimination of the filibuster would result in any less polarization. I fear that would result in far greater polarization.
I mean, I think it would require a party to appeal to a broader number of American voters to um, have power, right? If I know that all I need to do is, win 41 seats in the Senate to hamstring my opponent's agenda, that's a really small number of voters that I have to win over. Um, if I know that I need to win um, 50 or 51, depending on who's in the White House, um, that's a broader uh, coalition, I guess, that I have to build in order to have a meaningful amount of power. And again, I see that as going hand in hand, with making the Senate more proportionally representative. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense, that not to go after your home state, but that South Dakota has the same representation as say California. I think that balancing, by state made more sense in an era where the states were fighting with each other all the time, but now the fight is really between Democrats and Republicans, and I think that balancing by kind of trying to account for uh, state representation in an era where the main fight is between parties doesn't make as much sense. And I think having political parties need to appeal to a broad coalition of voters. I think would help.
I certainly agree, but I think the definition of the filibuster is requiring the appeal to a broad set of voters. I think of in the aftermath of the '08 election, the Democrats did such this, right? They had 60 seats in the Senate, which enabled them to pass the Affordable Care Act. Had they not had 60 seats, that piece of legislation would have never gone through. Not a single Republican voted for the ACA. And so I think currently right now, if we're talking about, Republicans being able to take advantage of a system that favors small states over large states, well, they have a 53 seat majority right now. And so if we understand 51 seats to be a broad coalition, they've certainly satisfied that requirement. But I guess maybe our divergence here would be that I don't consider a simple majority, which in the Senate would be 51, to be a broad enough coalition to warrant major legislation being rammed through without the advice and consent of the minority party. Which I guess maybe one frustration I would share with you is that it just simply doesn't seem that the Senate is working as an institution. Because the way we think of a filibuster traditionally would be like the Rand Paul, standing filibusters of 24 hours, or when Senator Cory Booker did it. But that's not really what filibusters are. It's just to agree to a cloture. So I would certainly concede to you that there are many instances in which the Senate simply cannot function. I am just weary as to whether or not lessening the requirement for the passage of legislation from 60 down to a bare bones majority would help the party heal. And maybe if the Senate was changed to be more representation of the populace, maybe it would. But I am hesitant.
Right. I mean, like I said, I do see those things, going hand in hand. I think filibuster reform alone, I agree, I think would be unlikely to have a significant effect.
Now, I want to get your take on this because I'm not a debater. I love to have these conversations, just if for nothing else, because it makes me more intelligent by talking to much more intelligent people than I. But one thought that I've had regarding polarization is that we are at a level when the Constitution was designed in 1787. I don't think, and granted, we were a very different country in the late 18th century than we are now, but I don't think the way our system was designed was to handle the most divisive issues, all of them put together at the national level. I think a retreat to more federalistic structure, more localism, would result in our national elections having lower stakes. Meaning that if more issues were handled at the state level, if California could decide its own policy on a said issue and Texas could decide its own issue, let California be California, let Texas be Texas, my initial thought would be that this would result in less polarization, because if I favor what Texas is doing, I can move to Texas. If I'm a Californian, I'm disgruntled with what California is doing, I can just leave the state. However, if my party isn't in control and the opposing party is control at the national level, I can't leave. I can't go to a different state, because national policy reigns supreme. I'm not saying that this argument's infallible, but I'm curious what your take on this is.
Yeah, I think that can help address polarization, which is explained by policy preference, right? That kind of ideological polarization that we were discussing before. But like I said, that's not the kind of polarization with which I'm primarily concerned. I don't think it's the kind of polarization that most people are primarily concerned with. And we know that that's not what drives most polarization, right? I mean, like I said, we've done these studies that really demonstrate that polarization, for the most part, is not driven by rational, like, policy preference. Um, so I'll give you an example. So I first got really interested in polarization when I was in middle and high school. I had my political awakening, I guess, during the first Trump campaign. I remember we went to the like a community meeting or whatever, and saw him like going down the golden escalator and saying all this crazy stuff about Mexicans. And everyone, I went, I went to school in Seattle. It was, a very kind of liberal leaning school. Seattle's pretty liberal leaning as well. And everyone's like, this guy's nuts. He's saying all these terrible things. And I've agreed. I didn't really like what I heard in that speech either. Um, But then as time went on, he didn't really seem to go anywhere. A lot of people in the country really seemed to support, um, his ideology, the stuff he was saying, and I started to wonder why that was. If he's so terrible, why does all have all the support? Um, and so I'd ask like my teachers that question, and they'd kind of say, "Oh, well, supporters are uh, stupid and bigoted, and that's the reason." And I was like, "That is not a good answer. Like that doesn't really, okay, why are they stupid and bigoted and we're not then, right? Like I couldn't really get a good answer for like why people thought differently from us. And and I don't think, and I really don't think that my teachers had a good answer to my question. And I don't think that's like a rational choice they were making. That's like, I'm not going to answer my list. I think they really didn't know. And I think the reason for that is this affective polarization that we're talking about, right? This sense of defensiveness, the need to, um, kind of protect the in group identity, and that kind of the fear of the out group. I think if we have and I was really frustrated by that. Like I wanted answers. I wanted to be able to meet people who thought differently from me. I wanted to be able to understand better. And I had to wait until like 2023 and go to Kentucky and meet someone from South Dakota to get an answer to that, and that was great. And I had a great time and it was great talking to them. We're talking now, but like it should not be that hard. And so I don't think a world where all the Republicans flee Seattle and move to Idaho and all the liberals in Idaho come and move to Seattle is going to help with that. I think that if polarization were primarily driven by policy preference and we were highly polarized, we might reasonably conclude that our differences in policy preference are too great for us to live alongside each other, and that's what we should do. Conservatives should move to Idaho, liberals should come to Washington, forget the whole thing. But we know that that's not true. We know that polarization is primarily driven by irrational and deeply rooted group psychology, and I don't think that federalism really addresses that.
I see your argument. I would posit, though, that the reason why we see this affective polarization, driving polarization, which I agree, is because everything is handled at one level. Because it is a zero-sum game. It's either my side wins or they don't. Maybe this would happen, maybe it wouldn't, but I certainly could see a future where that polarization's lessened if everyone has their day. If liberals can have their day in one state and conservatives can have their day in another state, maybe that polarization lessens. Maybe it doesn't. But it certainly is something interesting to think about. But I want to move into, perhaps I also want to address this notion of seeing the other side as stupid, because this is something I've always very much took to heart. I am maybe one of the few. Hopefully, I'm not the few. Hopefully, there's more of us with cross-cutting identities than I seem to think there is. But I am definitely someone who has cross-cutting identities that could be stereotyped into the Democratic Party or the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party. But I remember interacting with people across the country, hearing people call Trump voters stupid, uneducated, backward. And I always took this to heart because for a lot of my life, these were my neighbors, right? They were my teachers. They were my, operators of my favorite local business, what have you. And I am certainly not a defender of President Trump necessarily, but I've always thought, and this applies for conservatives who call liberal voters stupid as well, I've always believed that you can hate the politician. You can have a very strong dislike of Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or whoever it is, but you can't hate the voter. You can't hate the voter. And I think if more people adopted that position, perhaps we'd be in a better position.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'll caveat and say that I don't think that hate is a real thing. I think that when people use the word hate, what they really mean is, I'm afraid or I'm angry or something, but that's kind of hard to say. It's hard to be vulnerable like that. And So I'll caveat with that. But, kind of taking your point more broadly, um, you know, I um I think it is I don't know if I quite agree with you. I think it is reasonable to dislike a non-elected official just as much as an elected official on the basis of their, you know, political leanings. I don't really buy this view that we should not be considering people's politics in our personal relationships. I'm Jewish. If someone identifies as like a Nazi, I'm not going to be friends with them, and I feel good about that decision. I think the more relevant um, uh, factor, I guess, and the thing that really motivates me is the recognition that the people with whom I have political disagreements are not going anywhere. I think a lot of the time, I feel like I hear people talk about kind of drawing lines a lot. They say, when I kind of, express a desire for kind of more less polarization, people will say, well, at some point you have to draw a line. This political ideology is not morally acceptable. And so we have to draw a line and say that that is not that is not acceptable, that is not okay, and kind of and that's the metaphor, but I don't really know what's behind that metaphor. I mean, they're not, just because you've drawn the line and said this isn't acceptable doesn't mean they've gone anywhere. Like, you still have to live alongside them. And so I think that's really, what drives me. It's not about you know um artificially, I guess, tempering, our um dislike based on like whether they're an elected official or not, but it's more about recognizing that they're not going anywhere. And um therefore we're going to have to figure out a way um to live alongside one another. And I think the way we're not doing a great job of that um right now.
Well, and let me also add a caveat as well. When I say that we shouldn't hate the voter, I'm typically referring to the majority, because I do think, maybe I'm an optimist, but I do think a majority of people in both coalitions are fairly good people. I've interacted with a lot of them. And of course,
Sure.
I feel.
Sure. I mean, I use the example of Nazi, just for me. I didn't mean to paint with a broad
No.
brush like that, but I also mean to say that, I mean, there are people who would, say, I don't know, like, I, like, that are immigrants, for example, are involved in, immigrant communities. That's, and that think that would say that, what the Trump administration is doing about immigration is really not morally acceptable, and that they would not want to be friends with someone who supported that. That's a much broader. I think that's equally acceptable. I think people get to make that decision for themselves.
And also, I think it also should be caveated too that when I say, I used the term, you can hate the candidate, you can't hate the voter. What I mean by that is, although you can hate the candidates, and I don't think you should hate, pretty mainstream voters, right? Because I certainly would not infer that people whose very sense of self is threatened by someone else's political leanings, like literally, if, I can't be friends with this person because they literally want my identity wiped away. Certainly that's a very different circumstance, and I empathize with that. But I guess my broader point here is that when you speak to voters, it seems as though both sides equally view the other as an existential threat. The term fascist, for example, I've heard Republican voters prior to the 2024 election call the left fascists. And obviously, I've heard left-wing voters call Republicans fascists. And so my only concern here is that I'm not a member of either party, so I'm not here to defend either party, but it's hard to know the truth there, because if both parties are truly made up of fascists, what's the reason to talk to anyone who disagrees with you? Because it's like, of course, if there are certain things about my personal life and identity, if someone wanted me dead because of those things, I agree. I would want nothing to do with them. And so I think we're in a really dangerous place right now where both sides view the other as existential threats, kind of getting back into this life or death situation of politics. Both sides view the other party as such a threat to their way of life that there's really no reason to talk to the other side. It's just about winning. If we can win, we don't have to think about the minority. And that is so terrifying to me.
Right. I mean, I think I agree. I don't think people really think that through. Like what's really like the end. Like what we kind of got when we got to the line drawing. Like once I've drawn a lot of people kind of outside of the community, I mean, are we gonna just how are we getting rid of them really? I think people don't really think that through. Yeah, I mean, I guess you ask, what's the reason to and talk to someone who holds, political views that you find abhorrent. And again, I'm going to go back to, the reason is that they're not going anywhere. It, um, I don't think that the criteria for deciding whether, you're going to engage with someone can be, like, do I find this person's politics morally abhorrent, like beyond a certain point? It has to be, are there enough people that believe this that that there's like is there like a meaningful political coalition of people that believe this, that they have a significant say in like how society gets run? And if so, then for as long as we have a democracy, we've kind of got to. I think that's a big mistake that Democrats made during the first Trump campaign, and frankly ongoing. And I talked about how I'd go to my teachers and say, why do people like Trump? And they couldn't give me a good answer. And I think a big part of that, was that they were basing their answer on the feeling that, well, this guy sucks. He's a terrible guy, and therefore, you know, he's outside of the line, and I don't have to engage. I don't have to explain why people support him. I don't have to reckon with this, right? The decision was being made on kind of on that basis. Well, now it's been 10 years and he's still around, and I, um, so, what did that get you really? I think the decision has to be made, in a democracy. It has to be based on, whether this is an ideology that a significant number of people are buying into.
I want to, before we end, I want to talk about maybe some other potential solutions. And one of the things that we spoke about before we met for this conversation was this idea of return to participation in local community, right? If you're closer to a local community, especially in a local community where there is diverse representation of thought, perhaps this would help us heal. Or depolarization skills, which I would be really interested in letting you kind of explain that and flesh it out a bit.
Yeah, okay, we can start with localism, I guess. That's this one's interesting because it kind of is a lot like federalism, right? Except kind of from a cultural perspective rather than rather than a political change in, like, who has power, I guess. I think I'm a little more optimistic about this, and maybe this is my liberal bias showing that I'm more optimistic about localism than federalism. But hear me out. I think that I think we strengthen the muscles that we work, and we'll talk more about that, in that kind of skill building, solution that you mentioned. Local politics is less polarized than national politics, and therefore, if we spend more of our time engaging in local politics, we'll probably get better at engaging in politics in a way that is not as polarized. We'll get better at, um, being able to kind of build cross-cutting coalitions, and we'll be better at building at listening to people that don't agree with us on a certain policy, that kind of thing. I mean, uh, something, we talked about kind of studies that are related to polarization before, and one thing that can really help kind of break down those group psychology dynamics where people are favoring the in-group and uh, have mistrust towards the out-group are superordinate goals, right? At times when um, uh, people from different groups have to work together to accomplish something that they can't accomplish on their own. Um, Local politics can be a venue to do that. Now, theoretically, national politics is an option to do that too, but that's, we're struggling a little more with that right now, and so potentially local politics is a good place to practice that. Now, I'm going to give one caveat, which is to say that, yeah, we'd probably be less polarized. We focus more on local politics, but I think it's probably truer to flip that around and say that if we were less polarized, we would focus more on local politics. And this is kind of I think why I'm more optimistic about localism than federalism. I think it's generally understood that you as an individual person can have a bigger impact, you have more influence, more power in local politics than in national politics, right? Like you're from a purely like policy preference perspective, your time is better spent on local politics. Um, the reason we don't focus on local politics as much as we do on national politics is because of affective polarization, because of these, group psychological group dynamics. We want to see the blue team or the red team win on the national level. And so, the reason I kind of give this caveat is, that it can be difficult to focus on local government when polarization is high because our attention is constantly dragged towards the national level.
I do think I also want to caveat your answer with one example I can think of where more polarization actually led to more activity at the local level. And this is a pretty recent example. If we think back to COVID, many COVID policies were handled at the state level, and a lot of them were handled at the direct local level, the municipality, right? Major decisions about school boards. And you started seeing you saw some like moderately well-reasoned people show up to these meetings, I think articulating reasonable points about school closures, etc. And then, of course, you saw, people showing up to city council meetings, like trying to prove that the COVID vaccine was magnetic and putting spoons on their bodies, some pretty crazy stuff. But I think that's an exact example
Spoons aren't
of,
magnetic. Are spoons magnetic?
well, what they were arguing. This is a wild place to take this conversation, but
Sorry, I didn't.
no. There were people showing up to these school board meetings and city council meetings arguing against vaccine mandates, which I don't think in and of itself is necessarily I think one can make a reasoned argument there, but not by arguing that the COVID vaccine magnetized their body. And they were putting spoons on their chest to try to demonstrate that the spoons were sticking. Crazy.
I know what you're talking about. I don't think I knew about the spoon example. I have to look that up after this. Anyway,
I
continue.
tried, since I've started this platform, I try my best not to be dismissive of any viewpoints, but
That's pretty wacky.
There are limits. And I think if you are a spoon magnetization COVID-19 vaccine conspiracy theorist, I'd like to talk to you. Maybe, I don't know. Probably not. Anyways, I would argue that certainly one of the reasons why we don't see the same levels of polarization at the local municipality level is simply because they don't decide as divisive of issues, right? They handle roads, they handle bridges, they handle schools. And when they do, when those things do get politicized, such as schools, we do see that same partisanship take place like we saw at COVID school board meetings.
Interesting. Doesn't that kind of doesn't that kind of contradict what you said about federalism? I mean, if you right,
Certainly.
if
Absolutely.
local if you don't if local jurisdictions are handling more of these issues, then have we actually reduced polarization or just moved it elsewhere?
But you can see that you bring up a really excellent point. In some ways, it does contradict my position on federalism, but the difference is you can move schools. If you're unsatisfied with one school's vaccine policy
Well,
or
okay, but
mask policy,
now we're just going. Eventually, you can't move any. I mean, first you're saying, oh, well, we can't move
but if
country, so we got to go state. And now you're saying we can't move state, we got to move school. Eventually, your school's going to have to make a call. What are you going to do then?
okay, let's just dial it down for a minute. But my point being is that if these things were handled nationally, for example, if the federal government would have said all schools must, all students must wear masks or all students must not wear masks, there would be nowhere to go because the national government controls all 50 states. In South Dakota, for example, I'm sure we had very different policies regarding COVID than, say, Washington did, right? If I am someone who's a big proponent of masks or, vaccines or what have you, and I think we're getting lost in the COVID example, but it just serves as an illustrative example. When these issues are handled at the local and state level, it's still divisive and it's still polarizing, but at the end of the day, if it's not handled at the national level, and there are states or localities that share your like-minded position, you can still opt to migrate to those areas that share your policy preferences. Whereas if everything is handled at the national level, there is nowhere to go, because if you're in a disagreement with the national policy, there's nowhere that you can find that will hold your policy preference.
So, okay. So why don't we see that in this example then? I mean, why do we see big fights at the school boards, about these vaccine mandates instead of these people moving to a different school district?
Well, we certainly did, right? If you look at population exodus, for example, from California in the aftermath of 2020, we've certainly seen large numbers of people who were. I'm not saying that these people are right. I'm not saying that I disagree with California's policies necessarily, but we certainly have seen exactly what I'm talking about. In the aftermath of California's COVID policies, specifically to Texas and Florida, a lot of California residents have migrated out of the state.
True. I think I attribute that more to like housing prices
That
than
could
I
be.
do.
Yeah.
But okay,
Which is
right, fair
yeah.
enough. I
Yeah.
understand your point.
But
Um,
I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I've learned a lot from you, Milo. I think you're far more brilliant than I am and much more eloquently spoken. But I want to focus on this concept of depolarization skills, because one thing I've thought, I'm a big advocate of free speech, and it's a principled position. It's not a passion of mine that I use to defend my positions. I hope and I believe that I would defend my neighbor who disagrees with me, their free speech rights, just as much as I would defend my own. But one potential solution I've heard from strong advocates of free speech in terms of polarization is that in high school or in college, we should have students take seminars where they have to adopt opposing beliefs to their own, right? They have to step inside the shoes of an issue they disagree with and defend it. And this is just one example of what I think is in line with this idea of a depolarization skill, learning skills that can turn down the temperature, have a mutual understanding and empathy for those that you disagree with.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, you gave the actually I'll hold off on that example. I think that yes. I mean, this is the solution that I think is the most promising. Um, we having conversations across difference is really hard, and I think that's something that we miss a lot. Um, and I think, and this is not to call you out, but it's just something um, I notice is on your podcast you often ask you kind of you talk about giving, I guess, challenging your listeners to kind of go out and have more, I guess, like civil conversations. Is that how you would frame it?
Certainly, I would strongly encourage people to engage with people they disagree with.
Right. And um, I think that's a great thing to do, and I think also that framing can be um, can sometimes miss what makes it really hard, because I don't think it's a matter of will, really. I A couple years ago I was having a conversation with this woman, and um I mentioned that I was studying political science at Willamette University, which is a small like liberal arts college in Oregon. And she said, "Oh, that's great. Our politics is so divided. It's really great that you're studying this." Um, and and you can like help with that or whatever. I hope I am. But so we keep talking, and um, she says, and when I said I went to Willamette, she misheard me and thought I said Western Oregon, which is also a university nearby, and they're kind of more, I guess, red coded. I mean, it's a public university rather than the private liberal arts, and they study more like it's more like kind of agriculture focused, or that kind of thing. And she said something like, I'm surprised that you're studying that at Western. And I said, oh no, Willamette. And she said, oh yeah, that makes sense. And like the only reason those kids would ever study like the humanities is like for a gen ed or something. Yeah, and she said something that kind of implied that like people that went to Western Oregon were just like a bunch of like dumb hicks or something. She didn't say dumb hicks, but like that was kind of the implication. And only a couple of minutes ago she had expressed a desire for a less divided politics, right? And there's a contradiction there. And I don't think she was like lying when she said she wanted less divided politics. I think she just didn't really realize, I mean, what she was saying. And I think, she maybe saw, Western Oregon and, the kind of people that went there, I guess, as maybe something of a threat to kind of the more liberal identity. And so, I think what, that tells me is that it's not so much a matter of will, it's not just a matter of wanting to have civil conversations, of wanting a less divided politics. I mean, poll after poll shows that Americans really want that. I think in the last, I mean, they do polls all the time, but like what people's like biggest concerns are about like politics, or about what political issues people are most concerned with, and the economy is like always at the top. And in the most recent one, it was political division. Now we just had a pretty high profile like assassination, and I think that probably is why. And I think the economy is probably going to go back to the top pretty soon. But even so, I think that really shows that most Americans really care about this, and that the bottleneck is not in like wanting, is not that not enough people want to have a more, sorry, not that not enough people want to have a less divided politics, but people don't really know how to get there. And so this is where I think, you know, um, participating, in organizations which teach and practice depolarization are really important. I think about organizations like Braver Angels, or Bridge USA, that kind of host workshops related to this, that host debates, that basically teach people how to do this and bring people from different political perspectives together. Henry Clay is another good one. That one's a little more not as broad, but for you and I, right, that's something we were able to participate in, and I think it was a really meaningful experience. I mean, there are people write books about depolarization all the time. I mean, like there's a lot of uh, organizations that do. I took a class at Willamette called the Conversation Project, where we spent like a year studying this kind of thing. How to facilitate and participate in difficult conversations. Um, and um, I think that's really what the um, I think that's really more of what we need. And so I think it's great that you encourage your listeners to go out and have these difficult conversations, um, and um, and also I think that the biggest bottleneck is not the will, but it's knowing how to do that successfully. And so I guess my advice is to go, and Braver Angels has chapters all over the country. Check them out, or if you're in I think Bridge USA is more like a college focused version of that. They have a website. Go check. I think we strengthen the muscles that we use a lot, and I think we spend a lot of time strengthening our polarization muscles. A lot of institutions really encourage us to cling tightly to our political identity, to see a loss, as kind of like a defeat for the group. And I think, if this is something you really care about, I think it's important to be in, how I put it, I think it's important to be in communities where this is a value, where people are practicing depolarization and probably start out not being so good at it, and then get better over time. And you learn from people who are really good at it and can teach you. Um, I just wanting to do it a lot, kind of on your own, I think is a recipe for frustration and despair. And so I think it's really important to spend a lot of time in communities with people who also care about this and are willing to, who you can walk that road with, and who are willing to help you along the way.
Well, I certainly hope you're right that it's more so about the lack of a way, not will. I really do hope you're right. My experience, at least anecdotally, tells me something a little bit differently. The number of times I've heard, well, why won't you go talk to them? Well, because they're stupid. I think dismissal of opposing beliefs is very common, and this is not a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue. I think people are guilty of this on both sides, which I don't really feel the need, I guess, to defend what I'm doing here. But if I must, I'll say that, A, you'll never once see me tell a guest that they're wrong. In fact, I oftentimes believe I have much more to learn from my guests and vice versa. B, I will try my hardest never to interrupt anyone. Sometimes we get excited. And 3, invitations to come on this platform have ranged from socialist groups to Turning Point USA chapters to individual academics. Everyone is welcome here, and I'm not familiar with all the organizations that you put out, but I can speak to Bridge USA. Excellent organization. The work they do is fantastic. But I do want to wrap up on a concluding question. In the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death, Ezra Klein, who I have great respect for, I don't agree with him on everything. You don't have to agree with anyone on anything to listen to them. I think he's brilliant at what he does. And he put a piece out in the New York Times with the headline, "We're going to have to live together," which I think essentially sums up my answer to this question. But I want to ask you, is depolarization even realistic? And if it isn't, what's the point of even trying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, with, there are different kinds of polarization, right? So I think sorting, right, the idea that ideologies are, that liberals are Democrats, conservatives are Republicans, I think that's here to stay. It's a little odd that that was ever like not the case. I think that's kind of, there's kind of like this. I think if we had not had, such a long history of like slavery and segregation and like Democrats versus Dixiecrats and all the kind of weird um, cleavages, I think that would have happened a lot sooner. And so I think, sometimes we kind of look back on like the mid 20th century and think we can like get back to that, having like kind of uh, parties of mixed ideology. I think that's a mistake. I think a that was a that was the abnormal thing, and I think kind of the sorting we have now is the kind of natural consequence of like the political system we have. And I think that's fine, right? I mean, I think and some like uh, it's good that people with liberal ideas like know like which candidates they should vote for to have their ideas put into action. I think it's good that conservative people know who they should vote for to have their ideas. I think that makes sense. Um, I think really like our target should be the affective polarization, right? I mean, we know that affective polarization is driven primarily by group psychology, um, I right, rather than kind of rational thought and policy preference. And so, you know, there, I think it would be good to kind of shrink that gap. I think there will probably be some acrimony between people of different political parties, and I think that's fine. Like there should be some conflict. Yeah, people feel strongly about their political ideas, and that makes sense. But I think when we see such a large divide that makes it so difficult to govern, and we see that so little of that divide can be explained by policy preference, I think that really indicates that we have some uh, work to do, and that there's that's what that's what we can focus on, and that's why I kind of my main solution is that kind of those kind of depolarization skills. I mean, I know we spent a good amount of time talking about kind of more political solutions, and I think that's also valuable. But I think that those really get more at the um, other kinds of polarization that I'm not quite as concerned about. Although I mean there is some overlap. And I think with a decrease in effective polarization, we will probably also see a decrease in ideological polarization. I think there are a lot of people who would probably be more like moderate or have more cross-cutting policy preferences if they felt less dislike and distrust of their political opponents. Um, and I think when we that would be good. I mean, you want people who would be moderate if they were um, not making kind of um, I mean, we want people to, I guess, be able to be true to themselves and not feel like I'm a moderate, but I have to be more liberal to fit in with like my liberal identity. Um, but some people really are very liberal, and you know therefore some ideological polarization is here to stay, and that also I don't think, like I said, it's not necessarily um, uh, a bad thing. Moderation on its own is not necessarily like a virtuous thing, because moderation isn't really real, right? It's entirely dependent on like a political context. Um, uh, but I mean, you don't want people being moderate only to be able to uh, fit in more closely, with their group identity. That's really a recipe for bad policy making, and social conflict.
Well, I have a much less eloquent answer. My answer to this question would simply be I don't know. I don't know if depolarization is realistic or if we're already too far gone before things are going to get much worse. But I do know one thing, and that is that I'm willing to dedicate my entire life to trying to advocate for less polarization and crossing political divides that seem impassable. But I don't know. I call me an optimist, but I have a sense of hope that they're not impassable. But
Yeah,
regardless,
I mean,
anyone who presents the idea of a national divorce or a civil war as a solution uh, has no space in this dialogue from my perspective. I believe we have to live together, or else the consequences of not living together will be much, much more dire.
yeah, I mean, and I'll say, as well, I gave some kind of like reasons for. I kind of like said, I'm optimistic for these reasons, and you said I'm optimistic because I choose to be optimistic, and I think that's fantastic. Like, I think that's probably a better answer. I mean, you're right that optimism is a choice. I mean, it's not based on, um, you know, it shouldn't be dictated by like what we're looking at. It should just be a lens through which we choose to um, see the world. I think optimism is always the right choice. Regardless of what the situation is, because the alternative is despair, and that's always a bad idea.
Yeah. Well, for anyone listening to this, I hope this serves as a really excellent example of how two people can sit down and agree on most things, have disagreements, and still walk away with the same level of respect and feelings towards one another than they had before they entered into the conversation.
If
Milo, this
anything, I
has
like
been
him more.
Yes, absolutely. I find conversations with people I disagree with far more stimulating than people I agree with. Not to say that those conversations aren't good as well. But thank you so much for your time, Milo. I appreciate this.
Yeah, no, I had a great time. Thank you.